Chapter 14. It has dawned upon me that I have never placed a proper valuation upon womankind. For that matter, though not amative to any considerable degree so far as I have discovered, I was never outside the atmosphere of women until now. My mother and sisters were always about me, and I was always trying to escape them, for they worried me to distraction with their solicitude for my health and with their periodic inroads on my den. When my orderly confusion, upon which I prided myself, was turned into worse confusion and less order, though it looked neat enough to the eye, I never could find anything when they had departed. But now, alas, how welcome would have been the feel of their presence, the frou-frou and swish-swish of their skirts, which I had so cordially detested, I am sure, if I ever get home, that I shall never be irritable with them again. They may dose me and doctor me morning, noon, and night, and dust and sweep and put my den to rights every minute of the day, and I shall only lean back and survey it all, and be thankful in that I am possessed of a mother and some several sisters, all of which has set me wondering, where are the mothers of these 20 and odd men on the Ghost? It strikes me as unnatural and unhealthful that men should be totally separated from women and herd through the world by themselves. Coarseness and savagery are the inevitable results. These men about me should have wives and sisters and daughters. Then would they be capable of softness and tenderness and sympathy. As it is, not one of them is married. In years and years, not one of them has been in contact with a good woman or within the influence or redemption which irresistibly radiates from such a creature. There is no balance in their lives. Their masculinity, which in itself is of the brute, has been overdeveloped. The other and spiritual side of their natures has been dwarfed, atrophied. In fact, they are a company of celibates, grinding harshly against one another and growing daily more calloused from the grinding. It seems to me impossible sometimes that they ever had mothers. It would appear that they are a half-brute, half-human species, a race apart, wherein there is no such thing as sex, that they are hatched out by the sun like turtle eggs, or receive life in some similar and sordid fashion, and that all their days they fester in brutality and viciousness, and in the end die as unlovely as they have lived. Rendered curious by this new direction of ideas, I talked with Johansen last night the first superfluous words with which he has favored me since the voyage began. He left Sweden when he was 18, is now 38, and in all the intervening time has not been home once. He had met a townsman, a couple of years before, in some sailor boarding house in Chile, so that he knew his mother to be still alive. "She must be a pretty old woman now," he said, staring meditatively into the binnacle and then jerking a sharp glance at Harrison, who was steering a point off the course. "When did you last write to her?" He performed his mental arithmetic aloud. 81. No 82. No 83. Yes. 83. 10 years ago. From some little port in Madagascar. I was trading. You see, he went on, as though addressing his neglected mother across half the girth of the earth. Each year, I was going home. So what was the good to write? It was only a year. And each year something happened, and I did not go. But I am mate. Now. And when I pay off at Frisco, maybe with $500, I will ship myself on a windjammer round the Horn to Liverpool, which will give me more money, and then I will pay my passage from there home. Then she will not do any more work. But does she work now? How old is she? About 70, he answered. And then, boastingly, we work from the time we are born until we die. In my country. That's why we live so long. I will live to 100. I shall never forget this conversation. The words were the last I ever heard him utter. Perhaps they were the last he did utter, too. For going down into the cabin to turn in, I decided that it was too stuffy to sleep below. It was a calm night. We were out of the trades, and the ghost was forging ahead barely a knot an hour. So I tucked a blanket and pillow under my arm and went up on deck. As I passed between Harrison and the binnacle, which was built into the top of the cabin, I noticed that he was this time fully 3 points off. Thinking that he was asleep and wishing him to escape reprimand or worse, I spoke to him, but he was not asleep. His eyes were wide and staring. He seemed greatly perturbed, unable to reply to me. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Are you sick?" He shook his head, and with a deep sign as of awakening, caught his breath. "You'd better get on your course, then," I chided. He put a few spokes over, and I watched the compass card swing slowly to N, Io, and steady itself with slight oscillations. I took a fresh hold on my bedclothes and was preparing to start on, when some movement caught my eye and I looked astern to the rail. A sinewy hand, dripping with water, was clutching the rail. A second hand took form in the darkness beside it. I watched, fascinated. What visitant from the gloom of the deep was I to behold, whatever it was? I knew that it was climbing aboard by the log line. I saw a head, the hair wet and straight, shape itself, and then the unmistakable eyes and face of Wolf Larsen. His right cheek was red with blood, which flowed from some wound in the head. He drew himself inboard with a quick effort and arose to his feet, glancing swiftly, as he did so, at the man at the wheel, as though to assure himself of his identity and that there was nothing to fear from him. The seawater was streaming from him. It made little audible gurgles which distracted me. As he stepped toward me, I shrank back instinctively, for I saw that in his eyes, which spelled death. "All right, hump," he said in a low voice. "Where's the mate?" I shook my head. "Johansson," he called softly. "Johansson." "Where is he?" he demanded of Harrison. The young fellow seemed to have recovered his composure, for he answered steadily enough. "I don't know, sir. I saw him go for it a little while ago. So did I go, Ferrard. But you will observe that I didn't come back the way I went. Can you explain it? You must have been overboard, sir." "Shall I look for him in the steerage, sir?" I asked. Wolf Larsen shook his head. "You wouldn't find him." But you'll do. Come on. Never mind your betting. Leave it where it is." I followed at his heels. There was nothing stirring amidships. "Those cursed hunters," was his comment. "Too damned fat and lazy to stand a 4-hour watch." But on the forecastle head, we found 3 sailors asleep. He turned them over and looked at their faces. They composed the watch on deck, and it was the ship's custom, in good weather, to let the watch sleep with the exception of the officer, the helmsman, and the lookout. "Whose lookout?" he demanded. "Me, sir," answered Holyoke, one of the deep-water sailors, a slight tremor in his voice. I winked off just this very minute. Sir, I'm sorry. Sir, it won't happen again. Did you hear or see anything on deck? No, sir, But Wolf Larsen had turned away with a snort of disgust, leaving the sailor rubbing his eyes with surprise at having been let of so easily. Softly. Now. Wolf Larsen warned me in a whisper, as he doubled his body into the forecastle scuttle and prepared to descend. I followed with a quaking heart. What was to happen I knew no more than did I know what had happened. But blood had been shed, and it was through no whim of Wolf Larsen that he had gone over the side with his scalp laid open. Besides, Johansen was missing. It was my first descent into the forecastle, and I shall not soon forget my impression of it, caught as I stood on my feet at the bottom of the ladder. Built directly in the eyes of the schooner, it was of the shape of a triangle, along the three sides of which stood the bunks, in double tier, 12 of them. It was no larger than a hall bedroom in Grub Street, and yet 12 men were herded into it, to eat and sleep and carry on all the functions of living. My bedroom at home was not large, yet it could have contained a dozen similar forecastles. And taking into consideration the height of the ceiling, a score at least. It smelled sour and musty, and by the dim light of the swinging sea lamp, I saw every bit of available wall space hung deep with sea boots, oilskins, and garments, clean and dirty, of various sorts. These swung back and forth with every roll of the vessel, giving rise to a brushing sound, as of trees against a roof or wall. Somewhere, a boot thumped loudly and at irregular intervals against the wall, and, though it was a mild night on the sea, there was a continual chorus of the creaking timbers and bulkheads and of abysmal noises beneath the flooring. The sleepers did not mind. There were 8 of them, the 2 watches below, and the air was thick with the warmth and odor of their breathing, and the ear was filled with the noise of their snoring and of their sighs and half-groans, tokens plain of the rest of the animal man. But were they sleeping, all of them, or had they been sleeping? This was evidently Wolf Larsen's quest to find the men who appeared to be asleep and who were not asleep, or who had not been asleep very recently. And he went about it in a way that reminded me of a story out of Boccaccio. He took the sea lamp from its swinging frame and handed it to me. He began at the first bunks forward on the starboard side. In the top one lay Ufti, a Kanaka and splendid seaman, so named by his mates. He was asleep on his back and breathing as placidly as a woman. One arm was under his head. The other lay on top of the blankets. Wolf Larsen put thumb and forefinger to the wrist and counted the pulse. In the midst of it, the Kanaka roused. He awoke as gently as he slept. There was no movement of the body whatever. The eyes, moved. They flashed wide open, big and black, and stared, unblinking, into our faces. Wolf Larsen put his finger to his lips as a sign for silence, and the eyes closed again. In the lower bunk lay Louis, grossly fat and warm and sweaty, asleep unfeignedly and sleeping laboriously. While Wolf Larsen held his wrist, he stirred uneasily, bowing his body so that for a moment it rested on shoulders and heels. His lips moved, and he gave voice to this enigmatic utterance. "A shilling's worth a quarter, but keep your lamps out for threepenny bits, or the publicans'll shove 'em on you for 6pence. Then he rolled over on his side with a heavy, sobbing sigh, saying, A sixpence is a tanner, and a shilling a bob, but what a pony is I don't know. Satisfied with the honesty of his and the Kanaka's sleep, Wolf Larsen passed on to the next two bunks on the starboard side, occupied top and bottom, as we saw in the light of the sea lamp, by Leach and Johnson. As Wolf Larsen bent down to the lower bunk to take Johnson's pulse, I, standing erect and holding the lamp, saw Leach's head rise stealthily as he peered over the side of his bunk to see what was going on. He must have divined Wolf Larsen's trick and the sureness of detection, for the light was at once dashed from my hand, and the forecastle was left in darkness. He must have leaped, also, at the same instant, straight down on Wolf Larsen. The first sounds were those of a conflict between a bull and a wolf. I heard a great infuriated bellow go up from Wolf Larsen, and from Leach a snarling that was desperate and blood-curdling. Johnson must have joined him immediately, so that his abject and groveling conduct on deck for the past few days had been no more than planned deception. I was so terror-stricken by this fight in the dark that I leaned against the ladder, trembling and unable to ascend. And upon me was that old sickness at the pit of the stomach, caused always by the spectacle of physical violence. In this instance, I could not see, but I could hear the impact of the blows, the soft, crushing sound made by flesh striking forcibly against flesh. Then there was the crashing about of the entwined bodies, the labored breathing, the short, quick gasps of sudden pain. There must have been more men in the conspiracy to murder the captain and mate, for by the sounds, I knew that Leach and Johnson had been quickly reinforced by some of their mates. "Get a knife," somebody, Leach was shouting. "Pound him on the head, mash his brains out," was Johnson's cry. But after his first bellow, Wolf Larsen made no noise. He was fighting grimly and silently for life. He was sore beset. Down at the very first, he had been unable to gain his feet, and for all of his tremendous strength, I felt that there was no hope for him. The force with which they struggled was vividly impressed on me, for I was knocked down by their surging bodies and badly bruised. But in the confusion, I managed to crawl into an empty lower bunk out of the way. "All hands, we've got him. We've got him," I could hear Leach crying, who demanded those who had been really asleep, and who had wakened too, they knew not what. "It's the bloody mate," was Leach's crafty answer, strained from him in a smothered sort of way. This was greeted with whoops of joy, and from then on, Wolf Larsen had 7 strong men on top of him. Lewis, I believe, taking no part in it. The forecastle was like an angry hive of bees aroused by some marauder. "What ho below there?" I heard Latimer shout down the scuttle. Too cautious to descend into the inferno of passion, he could hear raging beneath him in the darkness. "Won't somebody get a knife? Oh, won't somebody get a knife?" Leach pleaded in the first interval of comparative silence. The number of the assailants was a cause of confusion. They blocked their own efforts, while Wolf Larsen, with but a single purpose, achieved his. This was to fight his way across the floor to the ladder. Though in total darkness, I followed his progress by its sound. No man less than a giant could have done what he did. Once he had gained the foot of the ladder, step by step, by the might of his arms, the whole pack of men striving to drag him back and down. He drew his body up from the floor till he stood erect, and then, step by step, hand and foot, he slowly struggled up the ladder. The very last of all, I saw, for Latimer, having finally gone for a lantern, held it so that its light shone down the scuttle. Wolf Larsen was nearly to the top, though I could not see him. All that was visible was the mass of men fastened upon him. It squirmed about, like some huge many-legged spider, and swayed back and forth to the regular roll of the vessel. And still, step by step with long intervals between, the mass ascended. Once it tottered, about to fall back, but the broken hold was regained and it still went up. "Who is it?" Latimer cried. In the rays of the lantern, I could see his perplexed face peering down. "Larsen," I heard a muffled voice from within the mass. Latimer reached down with his free hand. I saw a hand shoot up to clasp his. Latimer pulled, and the next couple of steps were made with a rush. Then, Wolf Larsen's other hand reached up and clutched the edge of the scuttle. The mass swung clear of the ladder, the men still clinging to their escaping foe. They began to drop off, to be brushed off against the sharp edge of the scuttle, to be knocked off by the legs which were now kicking powerfully. Leach was the last to go, falling sheer back from the top of the scuttle and striking on head and shoulders upon his sprawling mates beneath. Wolf Larsen and the lantern disappeared, and we were left in darkness. Chapter 15. There was a deal of cursing and groaning as the men at the bottom of the ladder crawled to their feet. "Somebody strike a light. My thumb's out of joint," said one of the men. Parsons, a swarthy, saturnine man, boat steerer in Standish's boat, in which Harrison was puller. "You'll find it knocking about by the bitts," Leach said, sitting down on the edge of the bunk in which I was concealed. There was a fumbling and a scratching of matches, and the sea lamp flared up, dim and smoky. And in its weird light, bare-legged men moved about nursing their bruises and caring for their hurts. Ufty laid hold of Parsons's thumb, pulling it out stoutly and snapping it back into place. I noticed at the same time that the Kanaka's knuckles were laid open clear across and to the bone. He exhibited them, exposing beautiful white teeth in a grin as he did so, and explaining that the wounds had come from striking Wolf Larsen in the mouth. "So it was you, was it? You black beggar," belligerently demanded one Kelly, an Irish-American and a longshoreman, making his first trip to sea, and boat puller for Kerfoot. As he made the demand, he spat out a mouthful of blood and teeth and shoved his pugnacious face close to Ufty. The Kanaka leaped backward to his bunk, to return with a second leap, flourishing a long knife. Go lay down. You make me tired." Leach interfered. He was evidently, for all of his youth and inexperience, cock of the forecastle. "Go on, you Kelly. You leave Ufty alone." How in hell did he know it was you in the dark? Kelly subsided, with some muttering, and the Kanaka flashed his white teeth in a grateful smile. He was a beautiful creature, almost feminine in the pleasing lines of his figure, and there was a softness and dreaminess in his large eyes, which seemed to contradict his well-earned reputation for strife and action. "How did he get away?" Johnson asked. He was sitting on the side of his bunk, the whole pose of his figure indicating utter dejection and hopelessness. He was still breathing heavily from the exertion he had made. His shirt had been ripped entirely from him in the struggle, and blood from a gash in the cheek was flowing down his naked chest, marking a red path across his white thigh and dripping to the floor. "Because he is the devil, as I told you before," was Leach's answer. And thereat, He was on his feet and raging his disappointment with tears in his eyes. And not one of you to get a knife was his unceasing lament. But the rest of the hands had a lively fear of consequences to come and gave no heed to him. How will he know which was which, Kelly asked, and as he went on he looked murderously about him unless one of us peaches. He'll know as soon as ever he claps eyes on us. Parsons replied, one look at you'd be enough. Tell him the deck flopped up and gouged your teeth out of your jaw. Lewis grinned. He was the only man who was not out of his bunk, and he was jubilant in that he possessed no bruises to advertise that he had had a hand in the night's work. Just wait till he gets a glimpse of your mugs tomorrow. The gang of you. He chuckled. We'll say we thought it was the mate, said one. And another. I know what I'll say, that I heard a row, jumped out of my bunk, got a jolly good crack on the jaw for my pains, and sailed in myself. Couldn't tell who or what it was in the dark, and just hid out. And 'twas me you hit. Of course, Kelly seconded, his face brightening for the moment. Leach and Johnson took no part in the discussion, and it was plain to see that their mates looked upon them as men for whom the worst was inevitable, who were beyond hope and already dead. Leach stood their fears and reproaches for some time. Then he broke out. You make me tired. A nice lot of gazabas you are. If you talked less with your mouth and did something with your hands, he'd have been done with by now. Why couldn't one of you, just one of you, get me a knife when I sung out, you make me sick, a beefin' and bellerin' round, as though he'd kill you when he gets you. You know damn well he won't, can't afford to. No shipping masters or beachcombers over here, and he wants you in his business, and he wants your bad. Who's to pull or steer or sail ship if he loses you? It's me and Johnson have to face the music. Get into your bunks, now, and shut your faces. I want to get some sleep. That's all right. Parsons spoke up. Maybe he won't do for us. But mark my words, hell'll be an icebox to this ship from now on. All the while I had been apprehensive concerning my own predicament. What would happen to me when these men discovered my presence I could never fight my way out as Wolf Larsen had done. And at this moment, Latimer called down the scuttles. Hump, the old man wants you. He ain't down here, Parsons called back. Yes, he is, I said, sliding out of the bunk and striving my hardest to keep my voice steady and bold. The sailors looked at me in consternation. Fear was strong in their faces, and the devilishness which comes of fear. I'm coming, I shouted up to Latimer. No, you don't, Kelly cried, stepping between me and the ladder, his right hand shaped into a veritable strangler's clutch. You damn little sneak, I'll shut your mouth. Let him go, Leach commanded. Not on your life, was the angry retort. Leach never changed his position on the edge of the bunk. Let him go, I say, he repeated. But this time his voice was gritty and metallic. The Irishman wavered. I made to step by him, and he stood aside. When I had gained the ladder, I turned to the circle of brutal and malignant faces peering at me through the semi-darkness. A sudden and deep sympathy welled up in me. I remembered the Cockney's way of putting it. How God must have hated them, that they should be tortured so. I have seen and heard nothing. Believe me, I said quietly. I tell yer, he's all right. I could hear Leach saying as I went up the ladder. He don't like the old man no more, nor you or me. I found Wolf Larsen in the cabin, stripped and bloody, waiting for me. He greeted me with one of his whimsical smiles. Come, get to work, Doctor. The signs are favorable for an extensive practice this voyage. I don't know what the ghost would have been without you. And if I could only cherish such noble sentiments, I would tell you her master is deeply grateful. I knew the run of the simple medicine chest the ghost carried, and while I was heating water on the cabin stove and getting the things ready for dressing his wounds, he moved about, laughing and chatting, and examining his hurts with a calculating eye. I had never before seen him stripped, and the sight of his body quite took my breath away. It has never been my weakness to exalt the flesh, far from it, but there is enough of the artist in me to appreciate its wonder. I must say that I was fascinated by the perfect lines of Wolf Larsen's figure, and by what I may term the terrible beauty of it. I had noted the men in the forecastle. Powerfully muscled though some of them were, there had been something wrong with all of them. An insufficient development here, an undue development there, a twist or a crook that destroyed symmetry, legs too short or too long, or too much sinew or bone exposed, or too little. Ufti had been the only one whose lines were at all pleasing, while, insofar as they pleased, that far had they been what I should call feminine. But Wolf Larsen was the man type, the masculine, and almost a god in his perfectness. As he moved about or raised his arms, the great muscles leapt and moved under the satiny skin. I have forgotten to say that the bronze ended with his face. His body, thanks to his Scandinavian stock, was fair as the fairest woman's. I remember his putting his hand up to feel of the wound on his head, and my watching the biceps move like a living thing under its white sheath. It was the biceps that had nearly crushed out my life once, that I had seen strike so many killing blows. I could not take my eyes from him. I stood motionless, a roll of antiseptic cotton in my hand unwinding and spilling itself down to the floor. He noticed me, and I became conscious that I was staring at him. "God made you well," I said. "Did he?" he answered. I have often thought so myself, and wondered why. Purpose I began. Utility, he interrupted. This body was made for use. These muscles were made to grip and tear and destroy living things that get between me and life. But have you thought of the other living things? They, too, have muscles of one kind and another, made to grip and tear and destroy. And when they come between me and life, I outgrip them, out-tear them, out-destroy them. Purpose does not explain that. Utility does. It is not beautiful, I protested. Life isn't. You mean? He smiled. Yet, you say I was made well. Do you see this? He braced his legs and feet, pressing the cabin floor with his toes in a clutching sort of way. Knots and ridges and mounds of muscles writhed and bunched under the skin. Feel them, he commanded. They were hard as iron, and I observed, also, that his whole body had unconsciously drawn itself together, tense and alert, that muscles were softly crawling and shaping about the hips, along the back, and across the shoulders, that the arms were slightly lifted, their muscles contracting, the fingers crooking till the hands were like talons, and that even the eyes had changed expression, and into them were coming watchfulness and measurement, and a light none other than of battle. Stability, equilibrium, he said, relaxing on the instant and sinking his body back into repose, feet with which to clutch the ground, legs to stand on and to help withstand, while with arms and hands, teeth and nails, I struggle to kill and to be not killed. Purpose utility is the better word. I did not argue. I had seen the mechanism of the primitive fighting beast, and I was as strongly impressed as if I had seen the engines of a great battleship or Atlantic liner. I was surprised, considering the fierce struggle in the forecastle, at the superficiality of his hurts, and I pride myself that I dressed them dexterously. With the exception of several bad wounds, the rest were merely severe bruises and lacerations. The blow which he had received before going overboard had laid his scalp open several inches. This, under his direction, I cleansed and sewed together, having first shaved the edges of the wound. Then the calf of his leg was badly lacerated and looked as though it had been mangled by a bulldog. Some sailor, he told me, had laid hold of it by his teeth at the beginning of the fight, and hung on and been dragged to the top of the forecastle ladder when he was kicked loose. By the way, Hump, as I have remarked, you are a handy man, Wolf Larsen began, when my work was done. As you know, we're short a mate. Hereafter you shall stand watches, receive $75 per month, and be addressed fore and aft as Mr. Van Weyden. I don't understand navigation, you know. I gasped. Not necessary at all. I really do not care to sit in the high places. I objected. I find life precarious enough in my present humble situation. I have no experience. Mediocrity, you see, has its compensations. He smiled as though it were all settled. I won't be mate on this hell ship, I cried defiantly. I saw his face grow hard and the merciless glitter come into his eyes. He walked to the door of his room, saying, "And now, Mr. Van Weyden, good night." "Good night, Mr. Larsen," I answered weakly. Chapter 16. I cannot say that the position of mate carried with it anything more joyful than that there were no more dishes to wash. I was ignorant of the simplest duties of mate, and would have fared badly indeed had the sailors not sympathized with me. I knew nothing of the minutiae of ropes and rigging, of the trimming and setting of sails, but the sailors took pains to put me to rights, Louis proving an especially good teacher, and I had little trouble with those under me. With the hunters it was otherwise. Familiar in varying degree with the sea, they took me as a sort of joke. In truth, it was a joke to me that I, the veriest landsman, should be filling the office of mate. But to be taken as a joke by others was a different matter. I made no complaint, but Wolf Larsen demanded the most punctilious sea etiquette in my case, far more than poor Johansen had ever received, and at the expense of several rows, threats, and much grumbling. He brought the hunters to time. I was Mr. Van Weyden fore and aft, and it was only unofficially that Wolf Larsen himself ever addressed me as Hump. It was amusing. Perhaps the wind would haul a few points while we were at dinner, and as I left the table he would say, "Mr. Van Weyden, will you kindly put about on the port tack?" And I would go on deck, beckon Louis to me, and learn from him what was to be done. Then, a few minutes later, having digested his instructions and thoroughly mastered the maneuver, I would proceed to issue my orders. I remember an early instance of this kind, when Wolf Larsen appeared on the scene just as I had begun to give orders. He smoked his cigar and looked on quietly till the thing was accomplished, and then paced aft by my side along the weather poop. "Hump," he said. "I beg pardon. Mr. Van Weyden, I congratulate you. I think you can now fire your father's legs back into the grave to him. You've discovered your own and learned to stand on them. A little rope work, sail making, an experience with storms and such things. And by the end of the voyage, you could ship on any coasting schooner. It was during this period, between the death of Johansen and the arrival on the sealing grounds, that I passed my pleasantest hours on the Ghost. Wolf Larsen was quite considerate. The sailors helped me, and I was no longer in irritating contact with Thomas Mugridge, and I make free to say, as the days went by, that I found I was taking a certain secret pride in myself. Fantastic as the situation was, a landlubber second in command, I was, nevertheless, carrying it off well. And during that brief time, I was proud of myself, and I grew to love the heave and roll of the Ghost under my feet as she wallowed north and west through the tropic sea to the islet where we filled our water casks. But my happiness was not unalloyed. It was comparative. A period of less misery slipped in between a past of great miseries and a future of great miseries. For the Ghost, so far as the seamen were concerned, was a hell ship of the worst description. They never had a moment's rest or peace. Wolf Larsen treasured against them the attempt on his life and the drubbing he had received in the forecastle, and morning, noon, and night, and all night as well. He devoted himself to making life unlivable for them. He knew well the psychology of the little thing, and it was the little things by which he kept the crew worked up to the verge of madness. I have seen Harrison called from his bunk to put properly away a misplaced paintbrush, and the two watches below hailed from their tired sleep to accompany him and see him do it. A little thing, truly. But when multiplied by the 1,000 ingenious devices of such a mind, the mental state of the men in the forecastle may be slightly comprehended. Of course, much grumbling went on, and little outbursts were continually occurring. Blows were struck, and there were always 2 or 3 men nursing injuries at the hands of the human beast, who was their master. Concerted action was impossible in face of the heavy arsenal of weapons carried in the steerage and cabin. Leach and Johnson were the 2 particular victims of Wolf Larsen's diabolic temper, and the look of profound melancholy which had settled on Johnson's face and in his eyes made my heart bleed. With Leach, it was different. There was too much of the fighting beast in him. He seemed possessed by an insatiable fury which gave no time for grief. His lips had become distorted into a permanent snarl, which at mere sight of Wolf Larsen broke out in sound, horrible and menacing, and, I do believe, unconsciously. I have seen him follow Wolf Larsen about with his eyes, like an animal its keeper, the while the animal-like snarl sounded deep in his throat and vibrated forth between his teeth. I remember once, on deck, in bright day, touching him on the shoulder as preliminary to giving an order. His back was toward me, and at the first feel of my hand, he leaped upright in the air and away from me, snarling and turning his head as he leaped. He had for the moment mistaken me for the man he hated. Both he and Johnson would have killed Wolf Larsen at the slightest opportunity, but the opportunity never came. Wolf Larsen was too wise for that, and besides, they had no adequate weapons. With their fists alone, they had no chance whatever. Time and again, He fought it out with Leech, who fought back always, like a wildcat, tooth and nail and fist, until stretched, exhausted or unconscious, on the deck. And he was never averse to another encounter. All the devil that was in him challenged the devil in Wolf Larsen. They had but to appear on deck at the same time, when they would be at it, cursing, snarling, striking, and I have seen Leech fling himself upon Wolf Larsen without warning or provocation. Once he threw his heavy sheath knife, missing Wolf Larsen's throat by an inch. Another time he dropped a steel marlin spike from the mizzen crosstree. It was a difficult cast to make on a rolling ship, but the sharp point of the spike, whistling 75 feet through the air, barely missed Wolf Larsen's head as he emerged from the cabin companionway and drove its length 2 inches and over into the solid deck planking. Still another time. He stole into the steerage, possessed himself of a loaded shotgun, and was making a rush for the deck with it when caught by Kerfoot and disarmed. I often wondered why Wolf Larsen did not kill him and make an end of it, but he only laughed and seemed to enjoy it. There seemed a certain spice about it, such as men must feel who take delight in making pets of ferocious animals. It gives a thrill to life, he explained to me, when life is carried in one's hand. Man is a natural gambler, and life is the biggest stake he can lay. The greater the odds, the greater the thrill. Why should I deny myself the joy of exciting Leech's soul to fever pitch for that matter? I do him a kindness. The greatness of sensation is mutual. He is living more royally than any man for'ard, though he does not know it. For he has what they have not purpose, something to do and be done, an all-absorbing end to strive to attain, the desire to kill me, the hope that he may kill me. Really, he is living deep and high. I doubt that he has ever lived so swiftly and keenly before, and I honestly envy him, sometimes, when I see him raging at the summit of passion and sensibility. But it is cowardly, cowardly, I cried. You have all the advantage. Of the two of us, you and I. Who is the greater coward? He asked seriously. If the situation is unpleasing, you compromise with your conscience when you make yourself a party to it. If you were really great, really true to yourself, you would join forces with Leech and Johnson. But you are afraid. You are afraid. You want to live. The life that is in you cries out that it must live, no matter what the cost. So you live ignominiously, untrue to the best you dream of, sinning against your whole pitiful little code, and, if there were a hell, heading your soul straight for it. Bah, I play the braver part. I do no sin, for I am true to the promptings of the life that is in me. I am sincere with my soul, at least, and that is what you are not. There was a sting in what he said. Perhaps, after all, I was playing a cowardly part. And the more I thought about it, the more it appeared that my duty to myself lay in doing what he had advised, lay in joining forces with Johnson and Leech and working for his death. Right here, I think, entered the austere conscience of my Puritan ancestry, impelling me toward lurid deeds and sanctioning even murder as right conduct. I dwelt upon the idea. It would be a most moral act to rid the world of such a monster. Humanity would be better and happier for it. Life fairer and sweeter. I pondered it long, lying sleepless in my bunk and reviewing in endless procession the facts of the situation. I talked with Johnson and Leech, during the night watches when Wolf Larsen was below. Both men had lost hope Johnson because of temperamental despondency, Leach because he had beaten himself out in the vain struggle and was exhausted. But he caught my hand in a passionate grip one night, saying, "I think you're square, Mr. Van Weyden, but stay where you are and keep your mouth shut. Say nothing but saw wood. We're dead men. I know it. But all the same, you might be able to do us a favor sometime when we need it damn bad." It was only next day, when Wainwright Island loomed to windward, close abeam, that Wolf Larsen opened his mouth in prophecy. He had attacked Johnson, been attacked by Leach, and had just finished whipping the pair of them. "Leach," he said, "you know I'm going to kill you sometime or other, don't you?" A snarl was the answer. "And as for you, Johnson, you'll get so tired of life before I'm through with you that you'll fling yourself over the side. See if you don't. That's a suggestion?" he added, in an aside to me. "I'll bet you a month's pay he acts upon it." I had cherished a hope that his victims would find an opportunity to escape while filling our water barrels. But Wolf Larsen had selected his spot well. The ghost lay half a mile beyond the surf line of a lonely beach. Here debauched a deep gorge with precipitous, volcanic walls which no man could scale, and here, under his direct supervision he went ashore himself. Leach and Johnson filled the small casks and rolled them down to the beach. They had no chance to make a break for liberty in one of the boats. Harrison and Kelly, however, made such an attempt. They composed one of the boat's crews, and their task was to ply between the schooner and the shore, carrying a single cask each trip. Just before dinner, starting for the beach with an empty barrel, they altered their course and bore away to the left to round the promontory which jutted into the sea between them and liberty. Beyond its foaming base lay the pretty villages of the Japanese colonists and smiling valleys which penetrated deep into the interior. Once in the fastnesses they promised, and the two men could defy Wolf Larsen. I had observed Henderson and Smoke loitering about the deck all morning, and I now learned why they were there. Procuring their rifles, they opened fire in a leisurely manner upon the deserters. It was a cold-blooded exhibition of marksmanship. At first their bullets zipped harmlessly along the surface of the water on either side the boat, but as the men continued to pull lustily, they struck closer and closer. "Now, watch me take Kelly's right oar," Smoke said, drawing a more careful aim. I was looking through the glasses, and I saw the oar blade shatter as he shot. Henderson duplicated it, selecting Harrison's right oar. The boat slewed around. The two remaining oars were quickly broken. The men tried to row with the splinters and had them shot out of their hands. Kelly ripped up a bottom board and began paddling, but dropped it with a cry of pain as its splinters drove into his hands. Then they gave up, letting the boat drift till a second boat, sent from the shore by Wolf Larsen, took them in tow and brought them aboard. Late that afternoon, we hove up anchor and got away. Nothing was before us but the 3 or 4 months hunting on the sealing grounds. The outlook was black indeed, and I went about my work with a heavy heart. An almost funereal gloom seemed to have descended upon the ghost. Wolf Larsen had taken to his bunk with one of his strange, splitting headaches. Harrison stood listlessly at the wheel, half supporting himself by it, as though wearied by the weight of his flesh. The rest of the men were morose and silent. I came upon Kelly crouching to the lee of the forecastle scuttle, his head on his knees, his arms about his head, in an attitude of unutterable despondency. Johnson I found lying full length on the forecastle head, staring at the troubled churn of the forefoot, and I remembered with horror the suggestion Wolf Larsen had made. It seemed likely to bear fruit. I tried to break in on the man's morbid thoughts by calling him away, but he smiled sadly at me and refused to obey. Leach approached me as I returned aft. "I want to ask a favor, Mr. Van Weyden," he said. "If it's your luck to ever make Frisco once more, will you hunt up Matt McCarthy? He's my old man. He lives on the hill, back of the Mayfair Bakery, running a cobbler's shop that everybody knows, and you'll have no trouble. Tell him I live to be sorry for the trouble I brought him and the things I done, and just tell him God bless him. For me." I nodded my head, but said, "We'll all win back to San Francisco, Leach, and you'll be with me when I go to see Matt McCarthy." "I'd like to believe you," he answered, shaking my hand, "but I can't. Wolf Larsen'll do for me. I know it, and all I can hope is he'll do it quick." And as he left me, I was aware of the same desire at my heart. Since it was to be done, let it be done with dispatch. The general gloom had gathered me into its folds. The worst appeared inevitable, and as I paced the deck, hour after hour, I found myself afflicted with Wolf Larsen's repulsive ideas. What was it all about? Where was the grandeur of life that it should permit such wanton destruction of human souls? It was a cheap and sordid thing after all, this life, and the sooner over, the better. Over and done with I, too, leaned upon the rail and gazed longingly into the sea, with the certainty that sooner or later I should be sinking down, through the cool green depths of its oblivion. Chapter 17. Strange to say, in spite of the general foreboding, nothing of a special moment happened on the Ghost. We ran on to the north and west till we raised the coast of Japan and picked up with the great seal herd, coming from no man knew where in the illimitable Pacific. It was traveling north on its annual migration to the rookeries of Bering Sea. And north we traveled with it, ravaging and destroying, flinging the naked carcasses to the shark and salting down the skins so that they might later adorn the fair shoulders of the women of the cities. It was wanton slaughter, and all for woman's sake. No man ate of the seal meat or the oil. After a good day's killing, I have seen our decks covered with hides and bodies, slippery with fat and blood, the scuppers running red, masts, ropes, and rails spattered with the sanguinary color, and the men, like butchers plying their trade, naked and red of arm and hand, hard at work with ripping and flensing knives, removing the skins from the pretty sea creatures they had killed. It was my task to tally the pelts as they came aboard from the boats, to oversee the skinning and afterward the cleansing of the decks and bringing things shipshape again. It was not pleasant work. My soul and my stomach revolted at it, and yet, in a way, this handling and directing of many men was good for me. It developed what little executive ability I possessed, and I was aware of a toughening or hardening which I was undergoing, and which could not be anything but wholesome for Sissy Van Weyden. One thing I was beginning to feel, and that was that I could never again be quite the same man I had been. While my hope and faith in human life still survived Wolf Larsen's destructive criticism, he had nevertheless been a cause of change in minor matters. He had opened up for me the world of the real, of which I had known practically nothing and from which I had always shrunk. I had learned to look more closely at life as it was lived, to recognize that there were such things as facts in the world, to emerge from the realm of mind and idea, and to place certain values on the concrete and objective phases of existence. I saw more of Wolf Larsen than ever when we had gained the grounds, for when the weather was fair and we were in the midst of the herd, all hands were away in the boats, and left on board were only he and I, and Thomas Mugridge, who did not count. But there was no play about it. The 6 boats, spreading out fan-wise from the schooner until the first weather boat and the last lee boat were anywhere from 10 to 20 miles apart, cruised along a straight course over the sea till nightfall or bad weather drove them in. It was our duty to sail the Ghost well to leeward of the last lee boat, so that all the boats should have fair wind to run for us in case of squalls or threatening weather. It is no slight matter for 2 men, particularly when a stiff wind has sprung up, to handle a vessel like the Ghost, steering, keeping lookout for the boats, and setting or taking in sail. So it devolved upon me to learn, and to learn quickly. Steering I picked up easily, but running aloft to the cross trees and swinging my whole weight by my arms when I left the ratlines and climbed still higher was more difficult. This, too, I learned, and quickly, for I felt somehow a wild desire to vindicate myself in Wolf Larsen's eyes, to prove my right to live in ways other than of the mind. Nay, the time came when I took joy in the run of the masthead and in the clinging on by my legs at that precarious height while I swept the sea with glasses in search of the boats. I remember one beautiful day when the boats left early and the reports of the hunters' guns grew dim and distant and died away as they scattered far and wide over the sea. There was just the faintest wind from the westward, but it breathed its last by the time we managed to get to leeward of the last lee boat. One by one I was at the masthead and saw the 6 boats disappeared over the bulge of the earth as they followed the seal into the west. We lay, scarcely rolling on the placid sea, unable to follow. Wolf Larsen was apprehensive. The barometer was down, and the sky to the east did not please him. He studied it with unceasing vigilance. "If she comes out of there," he said, hard and snappy, putting us to windward of the boats, "it's likely there'll be empty bunks in steerage and forecastle." By 11 o'clock, the sea had become glass. By midday, though we were well up in the northerly latitudes, the heat was sickening. There was no freshness in the air. It was sultry and oppressive, reminding me of what the old Californians term earthquake weather. There was something ominous about it, and in intangible ways one was made to feel that the worst was about to come. Slowly the whole eastern sky filled with clouds that overtowered us like some black sierra of the infernal regions. So clearly could one see canyon, gorge, and precipice, and the shadows that lie therein, that one looked unconsciously for the white surf line and bellowing caverns where the sea charges on the land. And still we rocked gently, and there was no wind. "It's no square," Wolf Larsen said. "Old Mother Nature's going to get up on her hind legs and howl for all that's in her, and it'll keep us jumping, hump, to pull through with half our boats. You'd better run up and loosen the topsails. But if it is going to howl, and there are only 2 of us," I asked, a note of protest in my voice, why we've got to make the best of the first of it and run down to our boats before our canvas is ripped out of us. After that, I don't give a rap what happens. The sticks'll stand it, and you and I will have to, though we've plenty cut out for us. Still, the calm continued. We ate dinner, a hurried and anxious meal for me with 18 men abroad on the sea and beyond the bulge of the earth, and with that heaven-rolling mountain range of clouds moving slowly down upon us. Wolf Larsen did not seem affected, however, though I noticed, when we returned to the deck, a slight twitching of the nostrils, a perceptible quickness of movement. His face was stern. The lines of it had grown hard, and yet in his eyes, blue, clear blue this day, there was a strange brilliancy, a bright, scintillating light. It struck me that he was joyous, in a ferocious sort of way, that he was glad there was an impending struggle, that he was thrilled and upborne with knowledge that one of the great moments of living, when the tide of life surges up in flood, was upon him. Once, and unwitting that he did so, or that I saw, he laughed aloud, mockingly and defiantly, at the advancing storm. I see him yet standing there like a pygmy out of the Arabian Nights before the huge front of some malignant genie. He was daring destiny, and he was unafraid. He walked to the galley. "Cookie, by the time you've finished pots and pans, you'll be wanted on deck. Stand ready for a call." "Hump," he said, becoming cognizant of the fascinated gaze I bent upon him. "This beats whiskey and is where your Omar misses. I think he only half lived after all." The western half of the sky had by now grown murky. The sun had dimmed and faded out of sight. It was 2 in the afternoon, and a ghostly twilight, shot through by wandering purplish lights, had descended upon us. In this purplish light, Wolf Larsen's face glowed and glowed, and to my excited fancy, he appeared encircled by a halo. We lay in the midst of an unearthly quiet, while all about us were signs and omens of oncoming sound and movement. The sultry heat had become unendurable. The sweat was standing on my forehead, and I could feel it trickling down my nose. I felt as though I should faint, and reached out to the rail for support. And then, just then, the faintest possible whisper of air passed by. It was from the east, and like a whisper it came and went. The drooping canvas was not stirred, and yet my face had felt the air and been cooled. "Cookie," Wolf Larsen called in a low voice. Thomas Mugridge turned a pitiable, scared face. "Let go that foreboom tackle and pass it across, and when she's willing, let go the sheet and come in snug with the tackle. And if you make a mess of it, it will be the last you ever make. Understand? Mr. Van Weyden, stand by to pass the headsails over. Then jump for the topsails and spread them quick as God'll let you. The quicker you do it, the easier you'll find it. As for Cookie, if he isn't lively, bat him between the eyes." I was aware of the compliment, and pleased, in that no threat had accompanied my instructions. We were lying head to northwest, and it was his intention to jibe over all with the first puff. "We'll have the breeze on our quarter," he explained to me. By the last guns, the boats were bearing away slightly to the southward. He turned and walked aft to the wheel. I went forward and took my station at the jibs. Another whisper of wind, and another, passed by. The canvas flapped lazily. "Thank God she's not coming all of a bunch, Mr. Van Weyden," was the Cockney's fervent ejaculation, and I was indeed thankful, for I had by this time learned enough to know With all our canvas spread, what disaster in such event awaited us? The whispers of wind became puffs, the sails filled, the Ghost moved. Wolf Larsen put the wheel hard up, to port, and we began to pay off. The wind was now dead astern, muttering and puffing stronger and stronger, and my head sails were pounding lustily. I did not see what went on elsewhere, though I felt the sudden surge and heel of the schooner as the wind pressures changed to the jibing of the fore and mainsails. My hands were full with the flying jib, and staysail, and by the time this part of my task was accomplished, the Ghost was leaping into the southwest, the wind on her quarter and all her sheets to starboard. Without pausing for breath, though my heart was beating like a trip hammer from my exertions, I sprang to the topsails, and before the wind had become too strong, we had them fairly set and were coiling down. Then I went aft for orders. Wolf Larsen nodded approval and relinquished the wheel to me. The wind was strengthening steadily and the sea rising. For an hour I steered, each moment becoming more difficult. I had not the experience to steer at the gait we were going on a quartering course. Now take a run up with the glasses and raise some of the boats. We've made at least 10 knots, and we're going 12 or 13 now. The old girl knows how to walk. I contested myself with the fore cross trees, some 70 feet above the deck. As I searched the vacant stretch of water before me, I comprehended thoroughly the need for haste if we were to recover any of our men. Indeed, as I gazed at the heavy sea through which we were running, I doubted that there was a boat afloat. It did not seem possible that such frail craft could survive such stress of wind and water. I could not feel the full force of the wind, for we were running with it. But from my lofty perch, I looked down as though outside the Ghost and apart from her, and saw the shape of her outlined sharply against the foaming sea as she tore along instinct with life. Sometimes she would lift and send across some great wave, burying her starboard rail from view and covering her deck to the hatches with the boiling ocean. At such moments, starting from a windward roll, I would go flying through the air with dizzying swiftness, as though I clung to the end of a huge, inverted pendulum, the arc of which, between the greater rolls, must have been 70 feet or more. Once, the terror of this giddy sweep overpowered me, and for a while I clung on, hand and foot, weak and trembling, unable to search the sea for the missing boats, or to behold aught of the sea but that which roared beneath and strove to overwhelm the Ghost. But the thought of the men in the midst of it steadied me, and in my quest for them, I forgot myself. For an hour, I saw nothing but the naked, desolate sea, and then, where a vagrant shaft of sunlight struck the ocean and turned its surface to wrathful silver, I caught a small black speck thrust skyward for an instant and swallowed up. I waited patiently. Again, the tiny point of black projected itself through the wrathful blaze a couple of points off our port bow. I did not attempt to shout, but communicated the news to Wolf Larsen by waving my arm. He changed the course, and I signaled affirmation when the speck showed dead ahead. It grew larger, and so swiftly that for the first time, I fully appreciated the speed of our flight. Wolf Larsen motioned for me to come down, and when I stood beside him at the wheel, gave me instructions for heaving to. "Expect all hell to break loose," he cautioned me, "but don't mind it. Yours is to do your own work and to have Cookie stand by the foresheet." I managed to make my way forward, but there was little choice of sides, for the weather rail seemed buried as often as the lee. Having instructed Thomas Mugridge as to what he was to do, I clambered into the fore-rigging a few feet. The boat was now very close, and I could make out plainly that it was lying head to wind and sea and dragging on its mast and sail, which had been thrown overboard and made to serve as a sea anchor. The 3 men were bailing. Each rolling mountain whelmed them from view, and I would wait with sickening anxiety, fearing that they would never appear again. Then, and with black suddenness, the boat would shoot clear through the foaming crest, bow pointed to the sky, and the whole length of her bottom showing, wet and dark, till she seemed on end. There would be a fleeting glimpse of the 3 men flinging water in frantic haste, when she would topple over and fall into the yawning valley, bow down, and showing her full inside length to the stern upreared almost directly above the bow. Each time that she reappeared was a miracle. The ghost suddenly changed her course, keeping away, and it came to me with a shock that Wolf Larsen was giving up the rescue as impossible. Then I realized that he was preparing to heave to, and dropped to the deck to be in readiness. We were now dead before the wind, the boat far away and abreast of us. I felt an abrupt easing of the schooner, a loss for the moment of all strain and pressure, coupled with a swift acceleration of speed. She was rushing around on her heel into the wind. As she arrived at right angles to the sea, the full force of the wind from which we had hitherto run away caught us. I was unfortunately and ignorantly facing it. It stood up against me like a wall, filling my lungs with air which I could not expel. And as I choked and strangled, and as the ghost wallowed for an instant, broadside on and rolling straight over and far into the wind, I beheld a huge sea rise far above my head. I turned aside, caught my breath, and looked again. The wave overtopped the ghost, and I gazed sheer up and into it. A shaft of sunlight smote the overcurl, and I caught a glimpse of translucent, rushing green, backed by a milky smother of foam. Then it descended. Pandemonium broke loose. Everything happened at once. I was struck a crushing, stunning blow, nowhere in particular and yet everywhere. My hold had been broken loose. I was underwater, and the thought passed through my mind that this was the terrible thing of which I had heard, the being swept in the trough of the sea. My body struck and pounded as it was dashed helplessly along and turned over and over, and when I could hold my breath no longer, I breathed the stinging salt water into my lungs. But through it all, I clung to the one idea: I must get the jib backed over to windward. I had no fear of death. I had no doubt but that I should come through somehow, and as this idea of fulfilling Wolf Larsen's order persisted in my dazed consciousness, I seemed to see him standing at the wheel in the midst of the wild welter, pitting his will against the will of the storm and defying it. I brought up violently against what I took to be the rail, breathed, and breathed the sweet air again. I tried to rise, but struck my head and was knocked back on hands and knees. By some freak of the waters, I had been swept clear under the forecastle head and into the eyes. As I scrambled out on all fours, I passed over the body of Thomas Mugridge, who lay in a groaning heap. There was no time to investigate. I must get the jib backed over. When I emerged on deck, it seemed that the end of everything had come. On all sides there was a rending and crashing of wood and steel and canvas. The Ghost was being wrenched and torn to fragments. The foresail and foretopsail, emptied of the wind by the maneuver, and with no one to bring in the sheet in time, were thundering into ribbons, the heavy boom threshing and splintering from rail to rail. The air was thick with flying wreckage. Detached ropes and stays were hissing and coiling like snakes. And down through it all crashed the gaff of the foresail. The spar could not have missed me by many inches, while it spurred me to action. Perhaps the situation was not hopeless. I remembered Wolf Larsen's caution. He had expected all hell to break loose. And here it was. And where was he? I caught sight of him toiling at the main sheet, heaving it in and flat with his tremendous muscles. The stern of the schooner lifted high in the air, and his body outlined against a white surge of sea sweeping past. All this, and more. A whole world of chaos and wreck. In possibly 15 seconds I had seen and heard and grasped. I did not stop to see what had become of the small boat, but sprang to the jib sheet. The jib itself was beginning to slap, partially filling and emptying with sharp reports, but with a turn of the sheet and the application of my whole strength each time it slapped. I slowly backed it. This, I know I did my best. I pulled till I burst open the ends of all my fingers, and while I pulled, the flying jib and staysail split their cloths apart and thundered into nothingness. Still, I pulled, holding what I gained each time with a double turn until the next slap gave me more. Then, the sheet gave with greater ease, and Wolf Larsen was beside me, heaving in alone while I was busied taking up the slack. "Make fast," he shouted, "and come on." As I followed him, I noted that in spite of rack and ruin, a rough order obtained. The Ghost was hove to. She was still in working order, and she was still working. Though the rest of her sails were gone, the jib, backed to windward, and the mainsail hauled down flat, were themselves holding, and holding her bow to the furious sea as well. I looked for the boat, and, while Wolf Larsen cleared the boat tackles, saw it lift to leeward on a big sea and not a score of feet away. And, so nicely had he made his calculation, we drifted fairly down upon it, so that nothing remained to do but hook the tackles to either end and hoist it aboard. But this was not done so easily as it is written. In the bow was Kerfoot, Oofty in the stern, and Kelly amidships. As we drifted closer, the boat would rise on a wave while we sank in the trough, till almost straight above me I could see the heads of the 3 men craned overside and looking down. Then, the next moment, we would lift and soar upward while they sank far down beneath us. It seemed incredible that the next surge should not crush the Ghost down upon the tiny eggshell. But, at the right moment, I passed the tackle to the Kanaka, while Wolf Larsen did the same thing forward to Kerfoot. Both tackles were hooked in a trice, and the 3 men, deftly timing the roll, made a simultaneous leap aboard the schooner. As the Ghost rolled her side out of water, the boat was lifted snugly against her, and before the return roll came, we had heaved it in over the side and turned it bottom up on the deck. I noticed blood spouting from Kerfoot's left hand. In some way, the 3rd finger had been crushed to a pulp, but he gave no sign of pain, and with his single right hand, helped us lash the boat in its place. "Stand by to let that jib over," you oofty, Wolf Larsen commanded. The very second we had finished with the boat, "Kelly, come aft and slack off the main sheet. You, Kerfoot, go forward and see what's become of Cookie Mr. Van Weyden. Run aloft again, and cut away any stray stuff on your way." And having commanded, he went aft with his peculiar tigerish leaps to the wheel. While I toiled up the foreshrouds, the ghost slowly paid off. This time, as we went into the trough of the sea and were swept, there were no sails to carry away. And, halfway to the crosstrees and flattened against the rigging by the full force of the wind, so that it would have been impossible for me to have fallen, the ghost almost on her beam ends and the masts parallel with the water. I looked, not down, but at almost right angles from the perpendicular, to the deck of the ghost. But I saw, not the deck, but where the deck should have been, for it was buried beneath a wild tumbling of water. Out of this water, I could see the two masts rising, and that was all. The ghost, for the moment, was buried beneath the sea. As she squared off more and more, escaping from the side pressure, she righted herself and broke her deck, like a whale's back, through the ocean surface. Then we raced, and wildly, across the wild sea, the while I hung like a fly in the cross trees and searched for the other boats. In half an hour, I sighted the second one, swamped and bottom up, to which were desperately clinging Jock Horner, Fat Louis, and Johnson. This time I remained aloft, and Wolf Larsen succeeded in heaving to without being swept. As before, we drifted down upon it. Tackles were made fast and lines flung to the men, who scrambled aboard like monkeys. The boat itself was crushed and splintered against the schooner's side as it came inboard, but the wreck was securely lashed, for it could be patched and made whole again. Once more the ghost bore away before the storm, this time so submerging herself that for some seconds I thought she would never reappear. Even the wheel, quite a deal higher than the waist, was covered and swept again and again. At such moments, I felt strangely alone with God, alone with Him, and watching the chaos of His wrath. And then the wheel would reappear, and Wolf Larsen's broad shoulders, his hands gripping the spokes and holding the schooner to the course of his will, himself an earth god, dominating the storm, flinging its descending waters from him and riding it to his own ends. And oh, the marvel of it, that tiny men should live and breathe and work and drive so frail a contrivance of wood and cloth through so tremendous an elemental strife. As before, the ghost swung out of the trough, lifting her deck again out of the sea, and dashed before the howling blast. It was now 5:30, and a half an hour later, when the last of the day lost itself in a dim and furious twilight, I sighted a third boat. It was bottom up, and there was no sign of its crew. Wolf Larsen repeated his maneuver, holding off and then rounding up to windward and drifting down upon it. But this time he missed by 40 feet. The boat passing astern. "Number 4 boat." "Ufti," Ufti cried, his keen eyes reading its number in the 1 second when it lifted clear of the foam. And upside down, it was Henderson's boat, and with him had been lost Holyoke and Williams, another of the deep water crowd. Lost they indubitably were, but the boat remained, and Wolf Larsen made one more reckless effort to recover it. I had come down to the deck, and I saw Horner and Kerfoot vainly protest against the attempt. "By God, I'll not be robbed of my boat by any storm that ever blew out of hell," he shouted. And though we 4 stood with our heads together that we might hear, his voice seemed faint and far, as though removed from us an immense distance. "Mr. Van Weyden," he cried, and I heard through the tumult as one might hear a whisper, "stand by that jib with Johnson and Oofty. The rest of you tail aft to the main sheet. Lively now, or I'll sail you all into kingdom, come understand." And when he put the wheel hard over, and the Ghost's bow swung off, there was nothing for the hunters to do but obey and make the best of a risky chance. How great the risk I realized when I was once more buried beneath the pounding seas and clinging for life to the pin rail at the foot of the foremast. My fingers were torn loose, and I swept across to the side and over the side into the sea. I could not swim, but before I could sink, I was swept back again. A strong hand gripped me, and when the Ghost finally emerged, I found that I owed my life to Johnson. I saw him looking anxiously about him and noted that Kelly, who had come forward at the last moment, was missing. This time, having missed the boat and not being in the same position as in the previous instances, Wolf Larsen was compelled to resort to a different maneuver. Running off before the wind with everything to starboard, he came about and returned close-hauled on the port tack. Grand Johnson shouted in my ear as we successfully came through the attendant deluge, and I knew he referred not to Wolf Larsen's seamanship, but to the performance of the Ghost herself. It was now so dark that there was no sign of the boat, but Wolf Larsen held back through the frightful turmoil as if guided by unerring instinct. This time, though we were continually half-buried, there was no trough in which to be swept, and we drifted squarely down upon the upturned boat, badly smashing it as it was heaved inboard. 2 hours of terrible work followed, in which all hands of us, 2 hunters, 3 sailors, Wolf Larsen and I reefed, first one and then the other, the jib and mainsail, hove to under this short canvas. Our decks were comparatively free of water, while the Ghost bobbed and ducked amongst the combers like a cork. I had burst open the ends of my fingers at the very first, and during the reefing I had worked with tears of pain running down my cheeks, and when all was done, I gave up like a woman and rolled upon the deck in the agony of exhaustion. In the meantime, Thomas Mugridge, like a drowned rat, was being dragged out from under the forecastle head where he had cravenly ensconced himself. I saw him pulled aft to the cabin and noted with a shock of surprise that the galley had disappeared. A clean space of deck showed where it had stood. In the cabin I found all hands assembled, sailors as well, and while coffee was being cooked over the small stove, we drank whiskey and crunched hardtack. Never in my life had food been so welcome, and never had hot coffee tasted so good. So violently did the Ghost pitch and toss and tumble that it was impossible for even the sailors to move about without holding on, and several times, after a cry of, "Now she takes it," we were heaped upon the wall of the port cabins as though it had been the deck. "To hell with a lookout," I heard Wolf Larsen say when we had eaten and drunk our fill. "There's nothing can be done on deck. If anything's going to run us down, we couldn't get out of its way. Turn in, all hands, and get some sleep." The sailors slipped forward, setting the sidelights as they went, while the 2 hunters remained to sleep in the cabin. It not being deemed advisable to open the slide to the steerage companion way, Wolf Larsen and I, between us, cut off Kerfoot's crushed finger and sewed up the stump. Mugridge, who, during all the time he had been compelled to cook and serve coffee and keep the fire going, had complained of internal pains, now swore that he had a broken rib or two. On examination, we found that he had 3, but his case was deferred to next day, principally for the reason that I did not know anything about broken ribs and would first have to read it up. I don't think it was worth it, I said to Wolf Larsen. A broken boat for Kelly's life. But Kelly didn't amount to much, was the reply. Good night. After all that had passed, suffering intolerable anguish in my finger ends, and with 3 boats missing, to say nothing of the wild capers the ghost was cutting, I should have thought it impossible to sleep. But my eyes must have closed the instant my head touched the pillow, and in utter exhaustion I slept throughout the night, the while the ghost, lonely and undirected, fought her way through the storm. Chapter 18. The next day, while the storm was blowing itself out, Wolf Larsen and I crammed anatomy and surgery and set Mugridge's ribs. Then, when the storm broke, Wolf Larsen cruised back and forth over that portion of the ocean where we had encountered it, and somewhat more to the westward, while the boats were being repaired and new sails made and bent. Sealing schooner after sealing schooner, we sighted and boarded, most of which were in search of lost boats, and most of which were carrying boats and crews they had picked up and which did not belong to them. For the thick of the fleet had been to the westward of us, and the boats, scattered far and wide, had headed in mad flight for the nearest refuge. 2 of our boats, with men all safe, we took off the Cisco, and I, to Wolf Larsen's huge delight and my own grief, he called smoke with Nilsson and Leach from the San Diego, so that, at the end of 5 days, we found ourselves short but 4 men: Henderson, Holyoke, Williams, and Kelly, and were once more hunting on the flanks of the herd. As we followed it north, we began to encounter the dreaded sea fogs. Day after day the boats lowered and were swallowed up almost ere they touched the water, while we on board pumped the horn at regular intervals and every 15 minutes fired the bomb gun. Boats were continually being lost and found, it being the custom for a boat to hunt, on lay, with whatever schooner picked it up, until such time it was recovered by its own schooner. But Wolf Larsen, as was to be expected, being a boat short, took possession of the first stray one, and compelled its men to hunt with the ghost, not permitting them to return to their own schooner when we sighted it. I remember how he forced the hunter and his 2 men below, a rifle at their breasts, when their captain passed by at biscuit toss and hailed us for information. Thomas Mugridge, so strangely and pertinaciously clinging to life, was soon limping about again and performing his double duties of cook and cabin boy. Johnson and Leach were bullied and beaten as much as ever, and they looked for their lives to end with the end of the hunting season, while the rest of the crew lived the lives of dogs and were worked like dogs by their pitiless master. As for Wolf Larsen and myself, we got along fairly well, though I could not quite rid myself of the idea that right conduct, for me, lay in killing him. He fascinated me immeasurably, and I feared him immeasurably. And yet, I could not imagine him lying prone in death. There was an endurance, as of perpetual youth, about him, which rose up and forbade the picture. I could see him only as living always, and dominating always, fighting and destroying, himself surviving. One diversion of his, when we were in the midst of the herd, and the sea was too rough to lower the boats, was to lower with 2 boat pullers and a steerer and go out himself. He was a good shot, too, and brought many a skin aboard under what the hunters termed impossible hunting conditions. It seemed the breath of his nostrils, this carrying his life in his hands and struggling for it against tremendous odds. I was learning more and more seamanship, and one clear day, a thing we rarely encountered now, I had the satisfaction of running and handling the Ghost and picking up the boats myself. Wolf Larsen had been smitten with one of his headaches, and I stood at the wheel from morning until evening, sailing across the ocean after the last lee boat, and heaving to and picking it and the other 5 up without command or suggestion from him. Galahs we encountered now and again, for it was a raw and stormy region, and, in the middle of June, a typhoon most memorable to me and most important because of the changes wrought through it upon my future. We must have been caught nearly at the center of this circular storm, and Wolf Larsen ran out of it and to the southward, first under a double-reefed jib, and finally under bare poles. Never had I imagined so great a sea. The seas previously encountered were as ripples compared with these, which ran a half-mile from crest to crest and which upreared, I am confident, above our masthead. So great was it that Wolf Larsen himself did not dare heave to, though he was being driven far to the southward and out of the seal herd. We must have been well in the path of the trans-Pacific steamships when the typhoon moderated, and here, to the surprise of the hunters, we found ourselves in the midst of seals, a second herd, or sort of rear guard, they declared, and a most unusual thing. But it was boats over the boom of guns, and the pitiful slaughter through the long day. It was at this time that I was approached by Leach. I had just finished tallying the skins of the last boat aboard, when he came to my side, in the darkness, and said in a low tone, "Can you tell me, Mr. Van Weyden, how far we are off the coast, and what the bearings of Yokohama are?" My heart leaped with gladness, for I knew what he had in mind, and I gave him the bearings west-northwest and 500 miles away. "Thank you, sir," was all he said as he slipped back into the darkness. Next morning, No. 3 boat and Johnson and Leach were missing. The water breakers and grub boxes from all the other boats were likewise missing, as were the beds and sea bags of the 2 men. Wolf Larsen was furious. He set sail and bore away into the west-northwest, 2 hunters constantly at the mastheads and sweeping the sea with glasses, himself pacing the deck like an angry lion. He knew too well my sympathy for the runaways to send me aloft as lookout. The wind was fair but fitful, and it was like looking for a needle in a haystack to raise that tiny boat out of the blue immensity. But he put the Ghost through her best paces so as to get between the deserters and the land. This accomplished, he cruised back and forth across what he knew must be their course. On the morning of the 3rd day, shortly after 8 bells, a cry that the boat was sighted came down from smoke at the masthead. All hands lined the rail. A snappy breeze was blowing from the west, with the promise of more wind behind it, and there, to leeward, in the troubled silver of the rising sun, appeared and disappeared a black speck. We squared away and ran for it. My heart was as lead. I felt myself turning sick in anticipation, and as I looked at the gleam of triumph in Wolf Larsen's eyes, his form swam before me, and I felt almost irresistibly impelled to fling myself upon him. So unnerved was I by the thought of impending violence to Leach and Johnson that my reason must have left me. I know that I slipped down into the steerage in a daze, and that I was just beginning the ascent to the deck, a loaded shotgun in my hands, when I heard the startled cry, "There's 5 men in that boat." I supported myself in the companionway, weak and trembling, while the observation was being verified by the remarks of the rest of the men. Then my knees gave from under me, and I sank down, myself again, but overcome by shock at knowledge of what I had so nearly done. Also, I was very thankful as I put the gun away and slipped back on deck. No one had remarked my absence. The boat was near enough for us to make out that it was larger than any sealing boat and built on different lines. As we drew closer, the sail was taken in and the mast unstepped. Oars were shipped, and its occupants waited for us to heave to and take them aboard. Smoke, who had descended to the deck and was now standing by my side, began to chuckle in a significant way. I looked at him inquiringly. "Talk of a mess," he giggled. "What's wrong?" I demanded. Again, he chuckled. "Don't you see there, in the stern sheets, on the bottom, 'May I never shoot a seal again, if that ain't a woman.'" I looked closely, but was not sure until exclamations broke out on all sides. The boat contained 4 men, and its 5th occupant was certainly a woman. We were agog with excitement, all except Wolf Larsen, who was too evidently disappointed in that it was not his own boat with the 2 victims of his malice. We ran down the flying jib, hauled the jib sheets to windward and the main sheet flat, and came up into the wind. The oars struck the water, and with a few strokes the boat was alongside. I now caught my first fair glimpse of the woman. She was wrapped in a long ulster, for the morning was raw, and I could see nothing but her face and a mass of light brown hair escaping from under the seaman's cap on her head. The eyes were large and brown and lustrous, the mouth sweet and sensitive, and the face itself a delicate oval, though sun and exposure to briny wind had burnt the face scarlet. She seemed to me like a being from another world. I was aware of a hungry outreaching for her, as of a starving man for bread. But then, I had not seen a woman for a very long time. I know that I was lost in a great wonder, almost a stupor. This, then, was a woman so that I forgot myself and my mate's duties, and took no part in helping the newcomers aboard. For when one of the sailors lifted her into Wolf Larsen's downstretched arms, she looked up into our curious faces and smiled amusedly and sweetly, as only a woman can smile, and as I had seen no one smile for so long that I had forgotten such smiles existed. "Mr. Van Weyden." Wolf Larsen's voice brought me sharply back to myself. "Will you take the lady below and see to her comfort make up that spare port cabin? Put Cookie to work on it, and see what you can do for that face. It's burned badly." He turned brusquely away from us and began to question the new men. The boat was cast adrift, though one of them called it a bloody shame with Yokohama so near. I found myself strangely afraid of this woman I was escorting aft. Also, I was awkward. It seemed to me that I was realizing for the first time what a delicate, fragile creature a woman is. And as I caught her arm to help her down the companion stairs, I was startled by its smallness and softness. Indeed, she was a slender, delicate woman as women go. But to me she was so ethereally slender and delicate that I was quite prepared for her arm to crumble in my grasp. All this, in frankness, to show my first impression. after long denial of women in general, and of Maud Brewster in particular. "No need to go to any great trouble for me," she protested, when I had seated her in Wolf Larsen's armchair, which I had dragged hastily from his cabin. "The men were looking for land at any moment this morning, and the vessel should be in by night. Don't you think so?" Her simple faith in the immediate future took me aback. How could I explain to her the situation? The strange man who stalked the sea like destiny, all that it had taken me months to learn. But I answered honestly, if it were any other captain except ours, I should say you would be ashore in Yokohama tomorrow. But our captain is a strange man, and I beg of you to be prepared for anything, understand, for anything. I confess I hardly do understand." She hesitated, a perturbed but not frightened expression in her eyes. Or is it a misconception of mine that shipwrecked people are always shown every consideration? This is such a little thing, you know. We are so close to land. Candidly, I do not know. I strove to reassure her. I wished merely to prepare you for the worst, if the worst is to come. This man, this captain, is a brute, a demon, and one can never tell what will be his next fantastic act. I was growing excited, but she interrupted me with an "oh." "I see," and her voice sounded weary. To think was patently an effort. She was clearly on the verge of physical collapse. She asked no further questions, and I vouchsafed no remark, devoting myself to Wolf Larsen's command, which was to make her comfortable. I bustled about in quite housewifely fashion, procuring soothing lotions for her sunburn, raiding Wolf Larsen's private stores for a bottle of port I knew to be there, and directing Thomas Mugridge in the preparation of the spare stateroom. The wind was freshening rapidly, the ghost heeling over more and more, and by the time the stateroom was ready, she was dashing through the water at a lively clip. I had quite forgotten the existence of Leach and Johnson, when suddenly, like a thunderclap, boat "ho" came down the open companionway. It was Smoke's unmistakable voice, crying from the masthead. I shot a glance at the woman, but she was leaning back in the armchair, her eyes closed, unutterably tired. I doubted that she had heard, and I resolved to prevent her seeing the brutality I knew would follow the capture of the deserters. She was tired? Very good. She should sleep. There were swift commands on deck, a stamping of feet and a slapping of reef points as the ghost shot into the wind and about on the other tack. As she filled away and heeled, the armchair began to slide across the cabin floor, and I sprang for it just in time to prevent the rescued woman from being spilled out. Her eyes were too heavy to suggest more than a hint of the sleepy surprise that perplexed her as she looked up at me, and she half stumbled, half tottered, as I led her to her cabin. Mugridge grinned insinuatingly in my face as I shoved him out and ordered him back to his galley work, and he won his revenge by spreading glowing reports among the hunters as to what an excellent Liddy's Maid I was proving myself to be. She leaned heavily against me, and I do believe that she had fallen asleep again between the armchair and the stateroom. This I discovered when she nearly fell into the bunk during a sudden lurch of the schooner. She aroused, smiled drowsily, and was off to sleep again. And asleep I left her, under a heavy pair of sailor's blankets, her head resting on a pillow I had appropriated from Wolf Larsen's bunk. Chapter 19. I came on deck to find the ghost heading up close on the port tack and cutting into windward of a familiar spritsail close-hauled on the same tack ahead of us. All hands were on deck, for they knew that something was to happen when Leach and Johnson were dragged aboard. It was 4 bells. Lewis came aft to relieve the wheel. There was a dampness in the air, and I noticed he had on his oilskins. "What are we going to have?" I asked him. "A healthy young slip of a gale from the breath of it, sir," he answered, "with a splatter of rain just to wet our gills and no more. Too bad we sighted them," I said, as the Ghost's bow was flung off a point by a large sea, and the boat leaped for a moment past the jibs and into our line of vision. Lewis gave a spoke and temporized. They'd never have made the land. "Sir, I'm thinking." "Think not?" I queried. "No, sir. Did you feel that A. Puff had caught the schooner, and he was forced to put the wheel up rapidly to keep her out of the wind? 'Tis no eggshell afloat on this sea an hour come, and it's a stroke of luck for them we're here to pick 'em up." Wolf Larsen strode aft from amidships, where he had been talking with the rescued men. The cat-like springiness in his tread was a little more pronounced than usual, and his eyes were bright and snappy. 3 oilers and a 4th engineer was his greeting. But we'll make sailors out of them, or boat pullers at any rate. Now, what of the lady? I know not why, but I was aware of a twinge or pang like the cut of a knife when he mentioned her. I thought it a certain silly fastidiousness on my part, but it persisted in spite of me, and I merely shrugged my shoulders in answer. Wolf Larsen pursed his lips in a long, quizzical whistle. "What's her name?" then he demanded. "I don't know," I replied. "She is asleep. She was very tired. In fact, I am waiting to hear the news from you." "What vessel was it?" "Mail steamer," he answered shortly. "The city of Tokyo, from Frisco, bound for Yokohama, disabled in that typhoon. Old tub, opened up top and bottom like a sieve. They were adrift 4 days, and you don't know who or what she is, maid, wife, or widow well." He shook his head in a bantering way and regarded me with laughing eyes. "Are you?" I began. It was on the verge of my tongue to ask if he were going to take the castaways into Yokohama. Am I what he asked? "What do you intend doing with Leach and Johnson?" He shook his head. "Really, Hump, I don't know. You see, with these additions, I've about all the crew I want, and they've about all the escaping they want." I said, "Why not give them a change of treatment? Take them aboard and deal gently with them. Whatever they have done, they have been hounded into doing. By me, by you." I answered steadily, "And I give you warning, Wolf Larsen, that I may forget love of my own life in the desire to kill you if you go too far in maltreating those poor wretches." "Bravo," he cried. "You do me proud. Hump, you found your legs with a vengeance. You're quite an individual. You were unfortunate in having your life cast in easy places, but you're developing, and I like you the better for it." His voice and expression changed. His face was serious. "Do you believe in promises?" he asked. "Are they sacred things?" "Of course," I answered. "Then here's a compact." He went on, consummate actor. "If I promise not to lay my hands upon Leach, will you promise, in turn, not to attempt to kill me?" "Oh, not that I'm afraid of you. Not that I'm afraid of you," he hastened to add. I could hardly believe my ears. What was coming over the man? "Is it a go?" he asked impatiently. "A go," I answered. His hand went out to mine. and as I shook it heartily, I could have sworn I saw the mocking devil shine up for a moment in his eyes. We strolled across the poop to the lee side. The boat was close at hand now, and in desperate plight. Johnson was steering, Leach bailing. We overhauled them about 2 feet to their 1. Wolf Larsen motioned Louis to keep off slightly, and we dashed abreast of the boat, not a score of feet to windward. The Ghost blanketed it. The spritsail flapped emptily, and the boat righted to an even keel, causing the 2 men swiftly to change position. The boat lost headway, and, as we lifted on a huge surge, toppled and fell into the trough. It was at this moment that Leach and Johnson looked up into the faces of their shipmates, who lined the rail amidships. There was no greeting. They were as dead men in their comrades' eyes. And between them was the gulf that parts the living and the dead. The next instant they were opposite the poop. Where stood Wolf Larsen and I? We were falling in the trough. They were rising on the surge. Johnson looked at me, and I could see that his face was worn and haggard. I waved my hand to him, and he answered the greeting, but with a wave that was hopeless and despairing. It was as if he were saying farewell. I did not see into the eyes of Leach, for he was looking at Wolf Larsen, the old and implacable snarl of hatred strong as ever on his face. Then they were gone astern. The spritsail filled with the wind, suddenly careening the frail open craft till it seemed it would surely capsize. A white cap foamed above it and broke across in a snow-white smother. Then the boat emerged, half swamped, Leach flinging the water out and Johnson clinging to the steering oar, his face white and anxious. Wolf Larsen barked a short laugh in my ear and strode away to the weather side of the poop. I expected him to give orders for the Ghost to heave to, but she kept on her course, and he made no sign. Louis stood imperturbably at the wheel, but I noticed the grouped sailors forward turning troubled faces in our direction. Still the Ghost tore along, till the boat dwindled to a speck, when Wolf Larsen's voice rang out in command, and he went about on the starboard tack. Back we held, 2 miles and more to windward of the struggling cockleshell, when the flying jib was run down, and the schooner hove to. The sealing boats are not made for windward work. Their hope lies in keeping a weather position, so that they may run before the wind for the schooner when it breezes up. But in all that wild waste, there was no refuge for Leach and Johnson, save on the Ghost, and they resolutely began the windward beat. It was slow work in the heavy sea that was running. At any moment they were liable to be overwhelmed by the hissing combers. Time and again, and countless times, we watched the boat luff into the big whitecaps, lose headway, and be flung back like a cork. Johnson was a splendid seaman, and he knew as much about small boats as he did about ships. At the end of an hour and a half, he was nearly alongside, standing past our stern on the last leg out, aiming to fetch us on the next leg back. "So you've changed your mind," I heard Wolf Larsen mutter, half to himself, half to them as though they could hear. "You want to come aboard? Well, then, just keep a-coming." Hard up with that helm, he commanded Oofty Oofty, the Kanaka, who had in the meantime relieved Louis at the wheel. Command followed command. As the schooner paid off, the fore and main sheets were slacked away for fair wind, and before the wind we were, and leaping, when Johnson, easing his sheet at imminent peril, cut across our wake 100 feet away. Again Wolf Larsen laughed, at the same time beckoning them with his arm to follow. It was evidently his intention to play with them. A lesson. I took it, in lieu of a beating, though a dangerous lesson, for the frail craft stood in momentary danger of being overwhelmed. Johnson squared away promptly and ran after us. There was nothing else for him to do. Death stalked everywhere, and it was only a matter of time when some one of those many huge seas would fall upon the boat, roll over it, and pass on. "'Tis the fear of death at the hearts of them," Lewis muttered in my ear as I passed forward to sea to taking in the flying jib and staysail. "Oh, he'll heave to in a little while and pick them up," I answered cheerfully. "He's bent upon giving them a lesson. That's all." Louis looked at me shrewdly. "Think so?" he asked. "Surely," I answered. "Don't you?" "I think nothing but ivy my own skin these days," was his answer. "And 'tis with wonder I'm filled as to the working out of things. A pretty mess that Frisco whiskey got me into, and a prettier mess that woman's got you into aft there. Ah, it's myself that knows ye for a blitherin' fool." "What do you mean?" I demanded, for having sped his shaft, he was turning away. "What do I mean?" he cried. "And it's you that asks me. 'Tis not what I mean, but what the wolf'll mean." "The wolf," I said. "The wolf. If trouble comes, will you stand by?" I asked impulsively, for he had voiced my own fear. "Stand by. 'Tis old fat Lewis I stand by. In trouble enough it'll be. We're at the beginnin' of things. I'm tellin' you. The bare beginnin' of things." "I had not thought you so great a coward," I sneered. He favored me with a contemptuous stare. If I raised never a hand for that poor fool, pointing astern to the tiny sail. "Do you think I'm hungerin' for a broken head for a woman I never laid me eyes upon before this day?" I turned scornfully away and went aft. "Better get in those topsails, Mr. Van Weyden," Wolf Larsen said, as I came on the poop. I felt relief, at least as far as the two men were concerned. It was clear he did not wish to run too far away from them. I picked up hope at the thought and put the order swiftly into execution. I had scarcely opened my mouth to issue the necessary commands when eager men were springing to halyards and downhauls, and others were racing aloft. This eagerness on their part was noted by Wolf Larsen with a grim smile. Still, we increased our lead, and when the boat had dropped astern several miles, we hove to and waited. All eyes watched it coming, even Wolf Larsen's, but he was the only unperturbed man aboard. Louis, gazing fixedly, betrayed a trouble in his face he was not quite able to hide. The boat drew closer and closer, hurling along through the seething green like a thing alive, lifting and sending and up-tossing across the huge-backed breakers, or disappearing behind them only to rush into sight again and shoot skyward. It seemed impossible that it could continue to live. Yet with each dizzying sweep, it did achieve the impossible. A rain squall drove past, and out of the flying wet the boat emerged, almost upon us. "Hard up. There," Wolf Larsen shouted, himself springing to the wheel and whirling it over. Again the ghost sprang away and raced before the wind, and for 2 hours Johnson and Leach pursued us. We hove to and ran away, hove to and ran away, and ever astern the struggling patch of sail tossed skyward and fell into the rushing valleys. It was a quarter of a mile away when a thick squall of rain veiled it from view. It never emerged. The wind blew the air clear again, but no patch of sail broke the troubled surface. I thought I saw for an instant the boat's bottom show black in a breaking crest. At the best, that was all. For Johnson and Leach, the travail of existence had ceased. The men remained grouped amidships. No one had gone below, and no one was speaking, nor were any looks being exchanged. Each man seemed stunned, deeply contemplative, as it were, and not quite sure, trying to realize just what had taken place. Wolf Larsen gave them little time for thought. He at once put the Ghost upon her course, a course which meant the seal herd and not Yokohama Harbor. But the men were no longer eager as they pulled and hauled, and I heard curses amongst them, which left their lips smothered and as heavy and lifeless as were they. Not so was it with the hunters. Smoke the Irrepressible related a story, and they descended into the steerage, bellowing with laughter. As I passed to leeward of the galley on my way aft, I was approached by the engineer we had rescued. His face was white. His lips were trembling. "Good God, sir, what kind of a craft is this?" he cried. "You have eyes. You have seen," I answered, almost brutally. What of the pain and fear at my own heart? "Your promise," I said to Wolf Larsen. I was not thinking of taking them aboard when I made that promise, he answered. And anyway, you'll agree, I've not laid my hands upon them. Far from it, far from it, he laughed a moment later. I made no reply. I was incapable of speaking. My mind was too confused. I must have time to think. I knew. This woman, sleeping even now in the spare cabin, was a responsibility, which I must consider. And the only rational thought that flickered through my mind was that I must do nothing hastily if I were to be any help to her at all.